I never thought a 50-pound bucket of ice melt would lead to criminal charges. But then again, I never expected to live in a neighborhood where the HOA president would literally steal from my front porch in broad daylight. My name is Harrison Daniels, and I moved to Maple Ridge Heights in suburban Cincinnati, Ohio, 6 months ago. The subdivision looked perfect online. Neat rows of colonial-style homes, manicured lawns, and a sense of community that seemed idyllic after years of apartment living. What the real estate agent failed to mention was that the homeowners association was run by a woman named Patricia Vanderbilt, though everyone in the neighborhood called her Trish the Terrible when they thought she couldn't hear them. I first met Patricia 3 days after moving in. She showed up at my door with a clipboard, her blonde highlighted hair sprayed into submission despite the August humidity, wearing a pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She was around 50, maybe 55, with the kind of pinched expression that suggested she'd been sucking on lemons for the better part of a decade. "Mr. Daniels," she said, not waiting for me to invite her in. "I'm Patricia Vanderbilt, president of the Maple Ridge Heights HOA. I need to discuss several violations I've observed on your property." I blinked, still holding the cardboard box of kitchen supplies I'd been unpacking. Violations? I just moved in. She consulted her clipboard with the efficiency of a military commander. "Your mailbox is the wrong shade of black. According to HOA regulations, Section 4.7, all mailboxes must be Benjamin Moore's Onyx, not whatever generic brand you've used. Additionally, your doormat is burgundy. Only navy blue or forest green doormats are permitted, and those lawn ornaments need to go immediately." Lawn ornaments. I looked past her to my front yard, where I'd placed exactly 2 things: a small metal rooster my late grandmother had given me, and a simple garden gnome my sister sent as a housewarming gift. "No decorative items are permitted in front yards except during approved holiday periods," Patricia said, making a note on her clipboard. "You have 48 hours to remedy these violations or face a $200 fine." That was my introduction to life under Patricia's reign. Over the next few months, I learned that she'd been HOA president for 7 years, running unopposed because anyone who dared challenge her either moved away or surrendered after she made their lives miserable with endless violation notices. She'd fine people for parking their cars on the street overnight, for planting unapproved flowers, for having Halloween decorations up 3 days past November 1st. She walked the neighborhood every morning at 6, hunting for infractions with the dedication of a bloodhound. My neighbor to the left, a retired teacher named Frank Morrison, told me she'd once measured everyone's grass with a ruler to ensure no blade exceeded the 3-inch maximum height specified in the HOA bylaws. My neighbor to the right, a nurse named Jennifer Chen, said Patricia had sued a family on Oakmont Drive because their Christmas lights were visible from the street after 10 at night, creating what she called light pollution that diminished property values. I kept my head down, followed the absurd rules, and tried to avoid Patricia as much as possible. That strategy worked reasonably well until winter arrived. December in Ohio that year was brutal. The first major snowstorm hit 3 days before Christmas, dumping 14 inches of white powder across greater Cincinnati. The temperature plummeted to 8 degrees, and the forecast promised another storm within 48 hours. I'd prepared for it, buying 2 50-pound buckets of premium ice melt from the hardware store and stocking up on enough groceries to last through the holidays without needing to venture out on treacherous roads. I spent Christmas morning shoveling my driveway and sidewalk, then spreading a generous layer of ice melt across every surface. The stuff wasn't cheap, about $40 per bucket, but it was effective. The blue-tinted crystals melted through ice faster than rock salt and were less damaging to concrete. I left one bucket in my garage and placed the other on my front porch, figuring I'd need quick access when the next storm hit. December 26th dawned cold and gray. I was working from home, my IT consulting job easily done from my home office upstairs, when I heard voices outside. I glanced out the window and saw Patricia marching down the street, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She was bundled in a designer puffy coat that looked like it belonged on a ski slope in Aspen, not suburban Cincinnati, and she was stopping at each house to inspect something. 10 minutes later, my doorbell rang. I already knew what was coming. "Mr. Daniels," Patricia said when I opened the door, her tone suggesting I'd committed some cardinal sin. "I'm conducting an inspection following yesterday's snowfall. Your sidewalk has been properly cleared, but I notice you've used ice melt with blue coloring. The HOA recently updated the guidelines to prohibit colored ice melt products. They can stain concrete and create an unsightly appearance that diminishes neighborhood aesthetics." I stared at her. "You're joking." "I never joke about HOA regulations." She thrust a paper at me. "This is the updated guideline, distributed via email 3 weeks ago. You have 24 hours to remove all colored ice melt from your property and replace it with clear rock salt, or face a $150 fine." "It's going to snow again tomorrow," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I'm not scrubbing ice melt off my sidewalk in 8-degree weather just because you don't like the color." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Daniels, I don't make the rules. The HOA board voted on this measure to maintain our community standards. If you have complaints, you're welcome to attend our next meeting in February and submit a formal grievance." February. The snow will be gone by then. Nevertheless, those are the proper channels. She turned to leave, then paused. "That's a very large bucket of ice melt on your porch. I trust you'll be disposing of it properly according to local hazardous waste guidelines." She walked away before I could respond, her boots crunching on the salted sidewalk I'd spent an hour clearing that morning. I went back inside and read through the updated guidelines she'd given me. It was 2 pages of dense text explaining how colored ice melt could potentially cause discoloration on concrete surfaces, and how the HOA had decided, in the interest of maintaining uniform property appearance, to ban all colored de-icing products. The guidelines included a helpful chart showing approved brands, all of which were significantly more expensive than what I'd purchased. I called Frank, who'd lived in the neighborhood for 12 years. "Oh yeah, she does this every winter," he said with a tired laugh. "Last year it was snow shovels. Said we could only use plastic shovels, not metal ones, because metal could scrape the sidewalk. Year before that, she tried to mandate what temperature we set our thermostats at because she claimed some people were wasting energy, and it reflected poorly on the neighborhood's environmental consciousness." "This is insane," I said. "How does she get away with this?" "Because most people just pay the fines rather than fight. And anyone who does fight ends up dealing with so much harassment that they either give up or move. She's got nothing better to do than police everyone's lives." I hung up feeling frustrated but resigned. I wasn't going to scrub my sidewalk clean just to appease Patricia's latest power trip, which meant I'd probably end up paying the fine. I could afford it, technically, but the principle grated on me. I paid HOA dues every month, supposedly for neighborhood maintenance and amenities, but as far as I could tell, that money just funded Patricia's reign of terror. The next day brought the promised snowstorm, another 12 inches added to what was already on the ground. I woke up at 5:30 to start shoveling before my first video conference call at 8. By 6:15, I'd cleared my driveway and was working on the sidewalk when I noticed something odd. The bucket of ice melt I'd left on my porch was gone. I stopped shoveling and looked around. I distinctly remembered leaving it there, on the right side of my porch next to the railing. The covered porch meant no snow had accumulated there, so the bucket hadn't been buried or knocked over. It had simply vanished. My first thought was that maybe I'd moved it into the garage and forgotten. I checked, but no, only the second bucket sat there on my utility shelf. I walked around my property, thinking maybe it had been knocked over and rolled somewhere, but there was nothing. The bucket, with probably 40 pounds of ice melt still inside, had disappeared. I was standing in my front yard, confused and increasingly annoyed when Jennifer came out of her house next door. "Morning, Harrison," she called, then saw my expression. "Everything okay? Did you see anyone near my house last night or this morning?" I had a bucket of ice melt on my porch and now it's gone. Jennifer shook her head, then hesitated. "Actually, wait. I was leaving for my night shift at the hospital around 6 yesterday evening and I saw Patricia walking around the neighborhood. She had something in a wagon, one of those folding utility wagons. I didn't think much of it at the time. A cold feeling that had nothing to do with the December temperature settled in my stomach. She was pulling a wagon. Yeah, the kind people use at the beach or for gardening. Seemed weird in the snow, but honestly, I was running late and didn't pay much attention. I thanked her and went back inside, my mind churning. Patricia had been at my house yesterday morning, had seen the bucket, had made a point of mentioning it. And then someone, possibly Patricia herself, had taken it that same evening. It seemed absurd. What kind of person stole ice melt? But then again, what kind of person measured grass height with a ruler? I called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation. The dispatcher sounded sympathetic but not particularly concerned. "You can file a theft report, sir, but for something like ice melt, it's unlikely we'd be able to recover it or identify the thief." "No cameras on your porch?" "No," I admitted. I'd thought about installing a Ring doorbell but hadn't gotten around to it yet. You could try asking neighbors if their cameras caught anything. Otherwise, best I can suggest is replacing it and securing it better. People sometimes steal packages or items left outside. I filed the report anyway, getting a case number mostly for insurance purposes, though my deductible was higher than the cost of the ice melt, so there wasn't much point. Then I drove to the hardware store, grumbling about having to spend another $40 because of someone's petty theft. When I got home around 9, finishing my sidewalk shoveling, Frank was outside dealing with his own driveway. "Hey Harrison, did you hear what happened to Patricia?" I looked up from spreading my newly purchased ice melt clear this time, just to avoid another violation notice. "No, what?" Frank's expression was somewhere between concerned and amused. "Apparently she slipped on her front steps this morning, landed pretty hard. Ambulance came and everything." "Is she okay?" "Broke her wrist, I heard. Maybe some bruised ribs. She'll live, but she's definitely hurting." He paused. "Funny thing though, her steps were completely iced over. No salt, no ice melt, nothing. Everyone else on the street had cleared their walks, but hers was like an ice rink." That was odd. Patricia was fanatical about property maintenance, always the first to point out when someone's sidewalk wasn't cleared within the HOA's mandated 24-hour window after snowfall. For her own steps to be untreated seemed completely out of character. "That is weird," I said. "You'd think she'd be the first person salting her walkway, right? Unless—" Frank trailed off, then shook his head. "Nah, never mind." "What?" I was just going to say unless she ran out of ice melt or something, but that doesn't make sense. Patricia's always over-prepared for everything. Unless she'd been planning to use someone else's ice melt, I thought but didn't say aloud. The suspicion felt mean-spirited, and I had no proof. Just because Patricia had been seen with a wagon and my ice melt had disappeared didn't mean she'd stolen it. Correlation wasn't causation. Maybe some neighborhood kids had taken it as a prank. Maybe I'd been the victim of random theft, but the coincidence bothered me. I spent the rest of the day working, fielding emails and video calls while trying to ignore the nagging feeling that I was missing something obvious. Around 3 in the afternoon, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. Mr. Daniels. This is Rebecca Montrose. I'm calling from Cincinnati General Hospital on behalf of Patricia Vanderbilt. My stomach dropped. Is she okay? I heard she fell. Mrs. Vanderbilt has a fractured wrist and some contusions, but she'll recover. However, she's asked me to contact you regarding a matter of compensation. Compensation. Rebecca's voice took on a carefully neutral tone that suggested she was reading from notes. Mrs. Vanderbilt claims that you failed to properly maintain your sidewalk following yesterday's snowfall, and that ice from your property extended onto hers, creating the hazardous condition that caused her fall. She's requesting that you cover her medical expenses and compensate her for pain and suffering. I sat there, stunned into silence for a moment. My sidewalk. I cleared and salted my entire sidewalk yesterday morning and again this morning. My property is completely clear. Mrs. Vanderbilt insists that runoff from your property created ice on hers. She's prepared to file a formal complaint with the HOA and potentially pursue legal action if you're unwilling to accept responsibility. The absurdity of it crashed over me. Patricia was trying to blame me for her fall when I'd done everything right, while her own steps had been left untreated. More than that, she was threatening legal action while I was increasingly convinced she'd stolen my ice melt. Tell Mrs. Vanderbilt that my property was properly maintained according to all HOA regulations and local ordinances. If she wants to pursue this further, she's welcome to contact my homeowner's insurance, but I'm not accepting liability for something I didn't cause. Rebecca sighed, and I heard the sound of someone saying something in the background. Then Patricia's voice came on the line, sharp despite whatever pain medication she was probably on. Mr. Daniels, I have multiple witnesses who will testify that your property maintenance has been substandard. You used prohibited ice melt products that create slippery runoff. You failed to adequately clear your sidewalk. Your negligence directly caused my injury, and I will be pursuing all available remedies. Patricia, I said, keeping my voice level with effort. Where's my ice melt? Silence on the other end. Then, I have no idea what you're talking about. The 50-pound bucket of ice melt that disappeared from my front porch yesterday evening. The same evening you were seen walking around the neighborhood with a utility wagon. Are you accusing me of theft, Mr. Daniels? Because that's slander, and I can add that to the list of it's only slander if it's false. I interrupted. I filed a police report this morning. Report number 248847. If you have information about where my property went, I'm sure the police would love to hear it. Another pause. I think we're done here. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. The line went dead. I sat there, gripping my phone, anger and disbelief warring in my chest. She'd actually threatened to sue me while I was now almost certain having stolen my property. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. I called Frank back and told him about the conversation. "Oh man," he said, "she's really going after you." Look, I hate to add to your problems, but you should know. Patricia doesn't make idle threats. Last year, she sued the Hendersons 3 houses down because their dog allegedly barked too much. Took them 6 months and $10,000 in legal fees before the case got dismissed. I'm not paying for her medical bills when I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not saying you should. I'm saying you need to protect yourself. Document everything. Photos of your property, receipts for the ice melt, the police report, everything. And maybe talk to a lawyer yourself, just to be prepared. He was right, of course. I spent the next hour photographing my entire property from every angle, showing the cleared sidewalks and properly treated surfaces. I took screenshots of the weather forecast and my call logs. I printed out my receipt from the hardware store showing the purchase of ice melt on December 23rd. Then, I called my homeowner's insurance company and gave them a heads up about Patricia's claims. The insurance agent, a patient woman named Carol, listened to the whole story and made sympathetic noises. Unfortunately, Mr. Daniels, claims like this aren't uncommon. We'll need to conduct an investigation if she files formally, but based on what you're telling me, it sounds like you maintained your property appropriately. Do you have any documentation of the alleged theft? Just the police report and a neighbor's statement that she saw Patricia with a wagon that evening. That's circumstantial, but it might be relevant. Here's what I recommend. If Mrs. Vanderbilt does pursue this, we'll provide legal representation. In the meantime, don't communicate with her directly. All contact should go through official channels, and if you get any more information about the ice melt, document it immediately. I thanked her and hung up, feeling slightly more secure but still angry. The rest of the evening passed in tense anticipation of further drama, but nothing happened. I kept checking my email for threatening letters from HOA lawyers, but my inbox remained mercifully clear of anything except work messages and spam. The next morning, December 28th, I was shoveling the light dusting of new snow from overnight when Jennifer came rushing over from her house. "Harrison, you need to see this." She pulled out her phone and showed me a post from the Maple Ridge Heights Facebook group, a page I'd joined but rarely checked. The post was from Patricia's account, posted at 6 that morning. Urgent. Negligent homeowner creates dangerous conditions. Yesterday, I suffered serious injuries due to a neighbor's failure to properly maintain their property. Ice and hazardous runoff from their improperly treated sidewalk created a dangerous situation that resulted in my fall and hospitalization. This is exactly why HOA regulations exist. When homeowners ignore safety protocols, people get hurt. I will be calling an emergency HOA meeting to discuss enhanced enforcement measures and penalties for violations that endanger residents. We cannot allow negligence to threaten our community. Below the post were dozens of comments, most from people I didn't know. Some expressed sympathy for Patricia. Others asked who the negligent neighbor was, and a few, I was relieved to see, pushed back against the narrative. One comment from a username I recognized as Martin Webb, who lived on Hickory Lane, read, "Patricia, with all due respect, maybe if you spent less time policing everyone else's properties and more time taking care of your own, this wouldn't have happened. I drove past your house after the storm and your steps were completely untreated. That's not anyone else's fault." Patricia had responded, "My property was properly maintained until runoff from surrounding properties contaminated my walkway." This is precisely the kind of ignorance that leads to tragedy. I showed the post to Jennifer. "This is ridiculous. She's straight up lying. I know, but look at all these people believing her." Jennifer scrolled through the comments. "She's got a bunch of her supporters saying you should be fined, kicked out of the HOA, all kinds of crazy stuff. They don't even know it's me she's talking about. Yet, Give her time. Patricia doesn't make vague accusations for long. Jennifer was right. By noon, I'd received 3 separate messages through the Facebook group from HOA board members requesting my presence at an emergency meeting scheduled for January 2nd at 7 in the evening. The messages were formal and cold, outlining serious allegations and my right to present a defense, as if I were on trial. I contacted the insurance company again, and Carol recommended I bring any documentation I had to the meeting. She also suggested I might want to consult with a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. "This is going to cost me a fortune," I said, "even if I'm completely innocent." "Unfortunately, that's often how these things work," Carol said sympathetically. "People like Mrs. Vanderbilt know that the process itself is the punishment. Even if she can't win, she can make your life difficult enough that you either give up or move." I wasn't about to do either. If Patricia wanted a fight, she'd get one. The day before the HOA meeting, January 1st, I was sitting in my living room reviewing my documentation when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find 2 police officers on my porch, one older male officer and one younger female officer. "Mr. Harrison Daniels?" the male officer asked. "Yes, that's me." "I'm Officer Mitchell. This is Officer Park. We're following up on the theft report you filed on December 27th. Do you have a few minutes to answer some questions?" I invited them in, surprised that the police were actually investigating what I'd assumed would be written off as a minor property crime. Officer Park pulled out a notebook while Officer Mitchell explained. "We've been reviewing security camera footage from several homes in your neighborhood. One of your neighbors has a camera system that covers their driveway and part of the street. We found some interesting footage from the evening of December 26th. She pulled out a tablet and showed me a video. The timestamp read 6:17 p.m., December 26th. The angle showed the street in front of my house, grainy but clear enough. As I watched, a figure came into frame pulling a wagon. Even in the dim streetlight, I recognized Patricia's distinctive coat. The video showed Patricia walking up my front path, disappearing from view toward my porch, then reappearing moments later with the wagon noticeably heavier, the bucket clearly visible. "That's my ice melt," I said. "And that's Patricia Vanderbilt, the HOA president." "We know," Officer Mitchell said. "We've already spoken with Mrs. Vanderbilt. She claims she was removing the ice melt because it violated HOA regulations and posed a hazard." "She stole it," I said flatly. "You can't just take someone's property because you claim it violates some rule." "That's theft." "We agree," Officer Park said. "Mrs. Vanderbilt seems to believe that her position as HOA president gives her authority to confiscate items she deems in violation of regulations. It doesn't. This is pretty clearly a theft case." Officer Mitchell nodded. "We've reviewed your HOA bylaws and covenants. While they give the HOA broad authority to levy fines and file liens for violations, there's nothing that authorizes the physical removal of property without the owner's consent. Mrs. Vanderbilt essentially admitted to taking your ice melt when we spoke with her." "What happens now?" I asked. "We're going to file charges for petty theft. Given the value of the item, it's a misdemeanor. Mrs. Vanderbilt will be issued a summons to appear in court. We'd also like you to provide a formal statement confirming that you did not give her permission to take the item and that you want to press charges." I gave them the statement right there, and they left after providing me with a case number and a contact if I had additional information. After they were gone, I sat down heavily on my couch, processing what had just happened. Patricia was going to be charged with theft. The HOA president was going to have a criminal record. The enormity of it should have felt satisfying. vindication for all her petty harassment and rule-mongering. Instead, I just felt tired. This whole situation had spiraled so far beyond what it should have been. If Patricia had just left my ice melt alone, none of this would be happening. The next evening, I arrived at the HOA meeting 15 minutes early, armed with a folder full of documentation and a grim determination to defend myself against whatever accusations Patricia had prepared. The meeting was held at the community center, a small building at the neighborhood entrance that hosted everything from HOA gatherings to kids' birthday parties. Inside, about 30 people were already seated in folding chairs arranged in rows facing a table where the HOA board members would sit. I recognized some faces from around the neighborhood, though I didn't know most of them well. Frank caught my eye from the third row and waved me over to a saved seat. "Big turnout," I murmured as I sat down. Patricia sent out a mass email yesterday saying this was a critical safety issue. She's got people fired up. Frank leaned closer. But word's gotten around about the police visit. Not everyone's on her side anymore. The board members filed in at 7 sharp. Patricia, her arm in a cast and a visible bruise on her cheek. Richard Steinberg, the vice president and a retired accountant. Margaret Keene, the secretary and a real estate agent. And Thomas Wu, the treasurer and a middle-aged lawyer. Patricia took her seat at the center of the table with some difficulty, wincing as she adjusted her position. "This emergency meeting of the Maple Ridge Heights HOA is now in session," she announced. "We're here to address a serious incident that occurred on December 27th involving negligent property maintenance that resulted in injury to a resident, namely myself. Mr. Harrison Daniels, please come forward." I walked to the front, feeling everyone's eyes on me. Patricia consulted a paper in front of her, though I suspected she had the whole speech memorized. "Mr. Daniels, you are accused of violating HOA Regulations Section 8.4, which requires all homeowners to maintain clear and safe walkways within 24 hours of precipitation. Your failure to properly treat your sidewalk resulted in hazardous runoff that contaminated neighboring properties, directly causing my fall and injury. How do you respond to these charges?" "I deny them completely," I said clearly. "I shoveled and treated my entire sidewalk according to regulations on both December 26th and 27th. My property was properly maintained. I have photographs, receipts, and witness statements to prove it." Richard leaned forward. "Mrs. Vanderbilt has provided photographs showing ice on her walkway. How do you explain that?" "Her walkway was untreated," I said. "Multiple neighbors observed that her steps had no salt or ice melt applied, which is why they were hazardous. That has nothing to do with my property maintenance." Patricia's face flushed. "This is absurd. I had fully intended to treat my walkway, but I was unable to do so because Mr. Daniels was using prohibited ice melt products that I had to confiscate for safety reasons." The room went very quiet. Thomas Wu, the lawyer, turned slowly to look at Patricia. "You confiscated his property." "I removed a hazardous material that violated HOA regulations," Patricia said. "It's within my authority as president to enforce." "No," Thomas interrupted. "It's not." "Patricia, please tell me you didn't actually take something from Mr. Daniels' property without his permission." "The bylaws clearly state. The bylaws state we can levy fines and file liens. They say nothing about physically removing property." Thomas looked at me. "Mr. Daniels, did you give Mrs. Vanderbilt permission to take your ice melt?" "Absolutely not. I filed a theft report with the police on December 27th. As of yesterday, the police have filed charges against Mrs. Vanderbilt for petty theft." The room erupted. Multiple people started talking at once, some directed questions at Patricia, others at me, creating a chaos of voices. Richard banged a gavel several times until the noise died down. Margaret was staring at Patricia with something like horror. "Patricia, is this true? Did you steal from a homeowner?" "I was enforcing HOA regulations." Patricia's voice rose, defensive and angry. "Mr. Daniels was using prohibited products that created a safety hazard. Someone had to take action before more people got hurt. If he had simply followed the rules in the first place, none of this would have happened." "So your defense," Thomas said slowly, "is that you stole his ice melt, didn't use it on your own walkway, slipped on your own untreated steps while presumably carrying his stolen property, got injured, and now want to blame him for your injury and have the HOA fine him for your negligence." Put like that, the absurdity of the situation was crystal clear. Even Patricia seemed to realize how bad it sounded, because her mouth opened and closed a few times without producing words. "I think we need to table this discussion," Richard said, looking profoundly uncomfortable. "Patricia, given the criminal charges and the conflict of interest, you probably shouldn't be running this meeting." "I'm still the president," Patricia snapped. "I was elected to enforce the rules and maintain standards, and that's exactly what I'm doing. If this board won't support me, then you're all complicit in the degradation of this neighborhood's values." Frank stood up in the audience. "Patricia, with all due respect, you stole from a neighbor, hurt yourself because you didn't salt your own walkway, and now you're trying to blame him for your mistakes. That's not enforcing rules, that's just being vindictive." Several people murmured agreement. Jennifer raised her hand and was recognized. "I'm Jennifer Chen. I live next to Mr. Daniels. I can confirm that his property has been properly maintained all winter. I saw Patricia walking around with a wagon the evening his ice melt disappeared. And I saw her walkway the morning she fell. It was solid ice, completely untreated. Whatever happened was not Harrison's fault." More murmurs of agreement. Martin Webb, the man who'd commented on Patricia's Facebook post, stood up. "I've lived here for 8 years, and I'm tired of this. Patricia has used her position to bully residents, levy ridiculous fines, and make everyone miserable. Maybe this incident is a wake-up call. We need new leadership." Patricia stood abruptly, her chair scraping back. "Fine. If you all want to side with someone who flagrantly violates regulations, who refuses to maintain community standards, then I don't want to be part of this board anymore. I resign, effective immediately." She grabbed her purse with her good hand and stalked toward the exit, but Thomas called after her. "Patricia, you still need to return Mr. Daniels' property." She stopped at the door, her back rigid. "I don't have it anymore." "Then you need to reimburse him for its value, or it remains a theft charge." "Send me a bill," she spat and left. The meeting dissolved into chaos again, with Richard eventually calling for order and saying they'd reconvene in a week once everyone had time to process what had happened. People clustered in small groups, discussing the drama in excited tones. Several neighbors approached me to apologize or express support, saying they'd had their own run-ins with Patricia's overreach. Frank clapped me on the shoulder. "Well, that was dramatic. Congratulations, you just ended Patricia's reign of terror." "I didn't mean to," I said honestly. "I just wanted to clear my sidewalk and not get blamed for something I didn't do. Sometimes that's how it happens. The tyrant pushes too far and everything collapses." I went home feeling strange, a mixture of relief and guilt and residual anger. The next few days passed quietly. Patricia didn't attend any neighborhood gatherings, and her house remained dark most evenings. Rumors circulated that she was considering moving, though nothing confirmed. On January 6th, I received a certified letter from Patricia's attorney. Inside was a check for $40 to cover the cost of the ice melt, along with a terse note stating that this constituted full restitution and that Patricia would be contesting the theft charges. The court date was set for February 14th, Valentine's Day, which felt like some kind of cosmic joke. I showed up at the Hamilton County Municipal Court in downtown Cincinnati with all my documentation, prepared to testify if necessary. The prosecutor, a young man named Andrew Chen, met with me beforehand. Mrs. Vanderbilt's attorney is pushing for a plea deal, he explained. She's willing to plead no contest to a reduced charge of unlawful taking of property, which carries a fine but no jail time. Given that this is her first offense and she's already provided restitution, the judge will likely accept it. What does that mean for her record? She'll have a misdemeanor conviction. It won't ruin her life, but it'll show up on background checks. And she'll be on probation for 6 months, which means any further infractions could lead to more serious consequences. I thought about it. Part of me wanted to push for the full theft charge, to see Patricia face maximum consequences for her actions. But another part of me just wanted this whole mess to be over. I'm okay with the plea deal, I said. As long as it's clear that she committed a crime and she can't claim she was in the right. Oh, it's clear. A no-contest plea means she's not admitting guilt, but accepting that the evidence would likely lead to a conviction. It's basically saying I'm not arguing about whether I did it. The hearing itself was brief. Patricia appeared with her attorney, a severe woman in a charcoal suit who looked deeply unimpressed with her client. When the judge asked if Patricia understood the charges and wished to enter a plea of no contest to the amended charge, Patricia said, "Yes, Your Honor," in a voice barely above a whisper. The judge accepted the plea, sentenced her to a $200 fine plus court costs, and ordered 6 months of unsupervised probation. He also took a moment to lecture her about respecting others' property, and how HOA authority didn't supersede basic laws, which Patricia endured with her jaw clenched and her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. And then it was done. I walked out of the courthouse into a cold February afternoon, feeling anticlimactic. All that drama, all that stress, and it ended with a brief hearing and a fine. Back in Maple Ridge Heights, life gradually returned to normal, or at least to a new version of normal. Richard Steinberg took over as interim HOA president and immediately moved to revise several of Patricia's more draconian regulations. The colored ice melt ban was rescinded. The grass height requirement was changed from 3 inches to 4 inches. Penalties for minor violations were reduced. A special election was held in March, and Thomas Wu won the presidency with a platform of reasonable enforcement and community cooperation, rather than authoritarian rule. At his first official meeting, he publicly apologized to me and several other homeowners who'd been excessively fined or harassed under Patricia's leadership. An HOA should serve its community, not terrorize it, he said. We're going to do better. Patricia herself became a ghost in the neighborhood. She stopped attending meetings entirely. Her house went on the market in late March, and by May it had sold. I never saw her again after the court hearing, though I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved to a condo in Anderson Township, a different part of Cincinnati, where presumably she could be someone else's problem. The whole experience left me with mixed feelings about HOAs in general. I understood their purpose, maintaining property values, ensuring neighborhoods stayed nice, providing common services. But I'd seen firsthand how easily that power could be abused by someone who viewed rules as weapons rather than guidelines. Frank told me over beers one evening in June, sitting on his back deck as spring turned toward summer, that Patricia had been dealing with a lot of personal issues during her time as HOA president. Her husband had left her 5 years earlier, her kids were grown and barely spoke to her, and she'd thrown herself into the HOA as a way to feel important and in control when her personal life was falling apart. "Doesn't excuse what she did," Frank said, "but it explains it a bit. Hurt people, you know." I did know, though it didn't change the fact that Patricia's hurt had caused real problems for dozens of people. Maybe, if she'd dealt with her issues in therapy instead of through enforcing arbitrary rules, everyone would have been better off. The summer passed peacefully. The neighborhood held a community barbecue in July, something we'd never done under Patricia's leadership, because she'd always voted down proposals for neighborhood social events, claiming they created noise violations and parking problems. Thomas Wu organized it, and nearly 100 people showed up. Kids played in the streets while adults chatted and ate burgers and hot dogs. It felt like what a community was supposed to be. I was manning the grill, flipping burgers alongside Martin Webb when Jennifer came over with a pitcher of lemonade. "This is nice," she said. "I'd forgotten that neighborhoods could actually be fun." "Patricia really did a number on this place," Martin agreed. "It's like everyone was walking on eggshells for years." "You know what the craziest part is?" I said, watching smoke rise from the grill. "All of that drama, everything that happened, was because she couldn't just leave a bucket of ice melt alone. If she'd just let me clear my sidewalk my way, she'd still be in charge." "Pride comes before the fall," Jennifer said. Literally in her case. We all laughed, though there was something sad underneath it. Patricia had had so much power, had been so convinced of her rightness, that she destroyed her own position rather than admit she might have been wrong about something. The tragedy wasn't that she'd been caught stealing or that she'd been charged with a crime. The tragedy was that she'd chosen that path in the first place when simply being reasonable would have worked out so much better for everyone. As summer turned to fall, I found myself actually enjoying life in Maple Ridge Heights. The HOA still existed, still collected dues and enforced reasonable regulations, but it felt like a service organization rather than an occupying force. When a shingle came loose on my roof during a storm in September, I got it fixed and reported it to the HOA as required, and received a polite acknowledgement rather than a violation notice threatening fines. The first snow of the new winter arrived in late November, just a dusting that barely covered the ground. I bought ice melt clear this time, just out of habit, and put one bucket in my garage and one on my porch. The next morning it was still there, unmolested, doing its job of preventing ice formation exactly as intended. I thought about Patricia sometimes, wondered how she was doing in her new place, whether she'd learned anything from the experience or just blamed everyone else for her downfall. I hoped she'd found some peace, though I didn't particularly care to find out for sure. Some chapters of life are better left closed. Frank and I were shoveling snow from our respective driveways on a Saturday morning in December, almost exactly a year after the whole incident, when he called over to me. "Hey Harrison, you ever think about running for the HOA board? Thomas is looking for another member." I paused mid-shovel. "You think I should? Why not? You've seen what happens when the wrong person gets power. Maybe it's good to have someone on the board who remembers that." I thought about it while finishing my driveway. The idea of being involved in HOA governance after everything I'd been through seemed ironic, but Frank had a point. Change happened when good people stepped up, when those who'd experienced problems worked to fix them rather than just complaining. "Maybe," I told Frank. "Let me think about it." As winter deepened, and the neighborhood settled into the quiet rhythm of short days and long nights, I did think about it. I thought about community and responsibility, about the fine line between maintaining standards and becoming a tyrant. I thought about Patricia, who'd let her personal pain turn her into someone who hurt others. And I thought about the kind of neighborhood I wanted to live in, the kind of community that served its residents rather than the other way around. By January, I decided to accept Thomas's invitation to join the board. At my first meeting in February, sitting at the same table where Patricia had once held court, I felt the weight of responsibility but also the opportunity. We discussed mundane things like snow removal contracts and tree trimming schedules, voted on painting the community center, and reviewed a request from a homeowner who wanted to install solar panels. It was boring, bureaucratic work, the kind of thing most people didn't want to spend their Tuesday evenings doing. But it mattered because it affected people's lives, their homes, their daily existence. Done right, an HOA could make a neighborhood better. Done wrong, it could make people miserable. I thought about that bucket of ice melt sometimes, sitting on my porch, such a small thing that had led to such large consequences. Patricia had stolen it thinking she was enforcing important rules, maintaining precious standards. Instead, she'd started a chain of events that cost her everything she'd worked to build. And all because she couldn't accept that maybe, just maybe, her way wasn't the only right way. The irony of her slipping on her own unsalted steps while carrying my stolen ice melt wasn't lost on anyone in the neighborhood. It had become a local legend, a cautionary tale about karma and cosmic justice. But I thought the real lesson was simpler. When you spend so much time policing everyone else's behavior, you stop paying attention to your own. Patricia had been so focused on my prohibited ice melt that she'd forgotten to treat her own walkway, and she'd literally fallen because of it. As spring arrived and the last of the snow melted away, Maple Ridge Heights felt like a different place than it had when I'd first moved in. The same houses, the same streets, but lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. People smiled more, chatted on sidewalks, let their kids play in yards without fear of violation notices. At the April HOA meeting, Thomas announced that we'd closed the fiscal year with a budget surplus for the first time in 5 years. Turns out when you're not spending thousands of dollars on legal fees to enforce petty violations, you have money left over for things the community actually needed, like fixing the playground equipment and replanting the landscaping at the entrance. I want to thank everyone for their patience during our transition period, Thomas said at the meeting. I know the past year has been turbulent, but I think we've come through it stronger. We've remembered that an HOA exists to serve homeowners, not the other way around. Light applause from the dozen residents in attendance, and I found myself nodding along. It had been a long, strange journey from that first violation notice about my mailbox color to sitting on the board helping make decisions for the neighborhood. But maybe that's how community worked. You showed up. You did your part. You tried to make things a little better than you found them. I never did get my original bucket of ice melt back. Patricia had claimed she didn't have it anymore, and I suspected she'd either used it on someone else's property or thrown it away in a fit of pique. But the $40 reimbursement check was framed on my wall, a reminder of the whole absurd situation. Friends who visited found it funny. This framed check with a memo line reading "Ice Melt Restitution," accompanied by a photo of me and Frank standing by our properly salted sidewalks. "You should sell tickets to tell the story," my sister said when she visited in May. "It's got everything. Petty tyranny, karma, a literal fall from grace. You could probably get it optioned for a movie." "I think I'll just stick with boring HOA meetings," I told her. But I wrote down the whole experience anyway. partially as catharsis and partially because it seemed like the kind of story that should be preserved. A warning to future HOA board members about what not to do, and a reminder to homeowners about the importance of staying involved in their communities. The community barbecue that summer was even bigger than the first one, with more than 200 people showing up. Thomas brought his karaoke machine, and there was an amateur singing competition that had the whole neighborhood laughing and cheering. At one point, Frank and I found ourselves sitting in lawn chairs, watching kids play basketball on the community court while the sun set orange and gold behind the tree line. "You know," Frank said, "I almost moved last year. Patricia had me so worn down with her constant violations and threats. I'd lived here 12 years, but I was ready to leave." "What changed your mind?" I asked. "You partially. Watching you stand up to her, refuse to just roll over and pay the fines. It reminded me that we didn't have to accept her version of how the neighborhood should be run. And then, when everything fell apart for her, it felt like maybe things could change. I wasn't trying to be some kind of hero," I said. "I just wanted to salt my sidewalk. Sometimes that's all it takes. One person saying no, this isn't right, and refusing to back down." I thought about that as the evening wound down and neighbors drifted home, calling goodnights and see you laters across the dimming streets. One person standing up, one small act of resistance against unreasonable authority. It shouldn't have been revolutionary, but in the microcosm of HOA politics, it had been. Patricia's old house had been purchased by a young couple with twin toddlers, the Stephensons. They were friendly and easygoing, the kind of neighbors who waved when they saw you and didn't complain about minor things. Their kids played in the front yard, something Patricia would never have tolerated, claiming it diminished the neighborhood's aesthetic appeal. I'd helped them move some furniture when they first arrived, and Mrs. Stephenson had asked about the neighborhood's HOA. "Is it strict? We've heard horror stories about some HOAs." "It used to be," I told her honestly, "but new leadership has made it much better. Now it's pretty reasonable, just basic maintenance requirements and common sense rules." She'd looked relieved. "Good. Our last place didn't have an HOA at all and it was chaos, but we didn't want to end up somewhere that would fine us for having the wrong color flowers." That was the balance, I realized. Structure without oppression, standards without tyranny. It was possible to have rules that maintained property values and neighborhood appeal without making residents feel like they were living under occupation. Patricia had never understood that, had seen every guideline as sacrosanct and every violation as a personal affront. The holidays came around again, and I bought my ice melt early, storing it safely in my garage until the first snow. When it finally fell in mid-December, I treated my walkway promptly and efficiently, and no one stole my supplies or accused me of using the wrong product. It was beautifully, blissfully boring. At the December HOA meeting, Thomas announced he was stepping down as president the following year due to work commitments. Several board members looked at me expectantly. "Don't even think about it," I said, laughing. "I'll stay on the board, but I'm not ready to be president." "Eventually you'll have to take a turn," Thomas said with a grin. "That's how community leadership works. Eventually, maybe, but not yet. I'm still recovering from last year's drama." Everyone laughed, because by now the story of Patricia and the ice melt had become neighborhood legend, told at barbecues and retold with increasing embellishment at Halloween parties. Some versions had her falling down an entire flight of stairs. Others had the police arresting her on the spot. The truth was dramatic enough, but people seemed to enjoy adding flourishes. I didn't mind. The story had become bigger than me, bigger than Patricia even. It had become a parable about the abuse of authority and the importance of accountability. about how even small acts of theft and dishonesty could spiral into life-changing consequences. It reminded people that positions of power came with responsibilities, and that those who wielded that power unjustly would eventually face consequences. As the year drew to a close, and I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized I'd learned more from that bucket of ice melt than from most other experiences in my adult life. I'd learned about standing up for yourself even when it would be easier to just pay the fine and move on. I'd learned about community and how collective action could overturn even well-entrenched authority. And I'd learned that karma, while not always immediate or obvious, had a way of working itself out in the end. Patricia had slipped on her own unsalted steps while carrying my stolen ice melt, and in that moment of poetic justice, she'd lost everything she'd spent years building. Her authority, her position, her reputation in the neighborhood all gone because she couldn't resist the petty tyranny of stealing someone's property to prove a point. I sometimes wondered if she'd learned anything from it, if she'd looked back and seen where she went wrong. Or if she'd just blamed everyone else, convinced that she'd been right and the world was wrong. I hoped for the former but suspected the latter. People like Patricia rarely changed. They just found new places to exercise their need for control. But that wasn't my problem anymore. My problem was making sure our neighborhood HOA continued to operate fairly and reasonably, that we maintained standards without becoming authoritarians. It was harder than it looked, finding that balance, but it was important work. As I locked up after the December meeting, turning off lights in the community center and making sure everything was secure, I looked out at the neighborhood streets with their neat rows of homes decorated for Christmas. Lights twinkled from roof lines, wreaths hung on doors, and inflatable snowmen bobbed in front yards. Under Patricia's rule, there had been strict regulations about holiday decorations, specific dates they could go up and come down, restrictions on colors and types, prohibitions on anything she deemed excessive. Now people decorated how they wanted, and the neighborhood was brighter for it. Not everything had to be uniform to be beautiful. Not every rule had to be enforced to maintain standards. Sometimes letting people be themselves, express themselves, make their own choices, created something better than any authoritarian could dictate. I drove home through those decorated streets, parked in my driveway, and walked up my properly salted sidewalk to my front door. Inside, my house was warm and welcoming, and I made dinner while thinking about how different this December felt from the last one. No stolen ice melt, no accusations, no drama, just a peaceful winter evening in a neighborhood that had finally learned to function as a community should. The bucket of ice melt sat in my garage, right where I'd left it, gradually depleting as I used it throughout the winter. Such a mundane object, just blue-tinted crystals in a plastic container, but it had been the catalyst for enormous change. Patricia had seen it as a violation to be punished. I'd seen it as a tool for maintaining safety. And in the collision of those two perspectives, an entire neighborhood power structure had collapsed. I thought about writing to Patricia, sending her a letter to thank her in some ironic way for inadvertently improving the neighborhood. But that felt petty, like rubbing salt in her wounds or ice melt on her unsalted steps. She'd paid for her mistakes with criminal charges, public humiliation, and forced relocation. That was punishment enough. Instead, I focused on being the best HOA board member I could be, on listening to homeowners' concerns and helping craft policies that served the community rather than controlling it. It was slow work, often frustrating, occasionally boring, but it mattered. And on cold winter mornings, when I went out to shovel my driveway and salt my walkway, I always took a moment to appreciate the simple act of maintaining my property without fear of theft or unjust accusations. I'd use my clear ice melt still, not the blue-tinted kind, just to avoid any echoes of past drama, and I'd think about how far we'd all come from that morning when Patricia slipped on her own steps while carrying my stolen bucket. She'd fallen, literally and figuratively, and in falling had freed an entire neighborhood from her tyrannical rule. It wasn't the ending anyone had expected, but it was the ending that had been needed. Sometimes justice came from unexpected places, delivered not by grand pronouncements or careful planning, but by simple karma and the natural consequences of one's own actions. As spring approached again, and the ice melt sat unused in my garage, waiting for next winter, I found myself grateful for the whole experience despite its stress and drama. It had taught me about community, about standing up for oneself, about the importance of reasonable governance. And it had given me a story that I'd probably be telling for the rest of my life. The story of how an HOA Karen stole my ice melt, then slipped on her own unsalted steps while carrying the bucket, and in doing so accidentally liberated an entire neighborhood from petty tyranny. It was absurd and it was true, and it was exactly the kind of thing that could only happen in America, where homeowners associations wielded outsized power, and occasionally that power corrupted absolutely. But it was also a story about recovery, about communities healing and finding better ways forward. Maple Ridge Heights was better now than it had been under Patricia's rule. We were friendlier, more connected, more willing to help each other and less afraid of arbitrary punishment. And if all it took was one woman's hubris and one man's refusal to back down over a bucket of ice melt, well, stranger things had sparked revolutions. The years would pass. New families would move in and old families would move out, and eventually the story would fade into neighborhood mythology, details blurring and changing with each retelling. But the core truth would remain. That authority unchecked leads to tyranny, that small acts of resistance matter, and that karma has a wicked sense of humor. And somewhere in Anderson Township, Patricia Vanderbilt presumably was living her life, hopefully having learned from her mistakes, but possibly just finding new battles to fight. I wished her well, in an abstract sort of way, because holding grudges seemed exhausting and counterproductive. But I also appreciated the ice melt sitting in my garage, that simple bucket of blue-tinted crystals that had inadvertently changed everything. It was almost gone now, used up over the course of the winter, but I'd buy more next fall and the cycle would continue. Snow would fall, I'd clear my sidewalks, and life would go on in its ordinary way. And isn't that what we all want in the end? Not drama or conflict or criminal charges, but just the simple ability to live our lives, maintain our homes, and be part of a community that supports rather than oppresses us. Patricia's legacy wasn't the rules she'd enforced or the fines she'd levied. It was the lesson she'd inadvertently taught us all about what not to become, about the dangers of letting power consume you until you slip on your own hubris. I stood in my garage one Saturday afternoon in late March, looking at the nearly empty bucket of ice melt, and I smiled. Spring was coming. Winter was ending and Maple Ridge Heights had survived and thrived. Patricia was gone, new leadership had taken hold, and the neighborhood was genuinely happy. All because one bucket of ice melt had been stolen, and one woman had learned the hard way that you reap what you sow, or in her case, that you slip on what you don't salt. It was poetic justice of the highest order, karma delivered with perfect comic timing, and a reminder that sometimes the universe has a sense of humor about human folly. I closed the garage door and walked back inside, ready for spring, ready for whatever came next, and deeply grateful that I lived in a neighborhood where I could salt my sidewalk without fear of theft or reprisal. It was such a small thing, really, but small things mattered. They were the foundation of daily life, and when they worked right, everything else became easier. The story of Patricia and the ice melt would live on, told and retold at neighborhood gatherings for years to come. But the real story was simpler. It was about a community that found its way back to sanity, one bucket of ice melt at a time.